Mara Whitfield's lungs burned as she tore through the snow, her boots sinking to the ankle with every stride. Behind her, she could hear them. 2 men, maybe 3. Their voices carried strangely in the thin mountain air, sharp and close even though she knew they were still some distance back. She did not look over her shoulder. Looking back had cost her precious seconds before, and she would not make that mistake again. The forest around her was a blur of white and black, snow-heavy branches and dark trunks rushing past as she pushed deeper into terrain she did not recognize. She had lost the trail an hour ago, back when the light was still gray with early morning. Now the sky had turned the color of dull iron, and the wind had picked up, driving needles of ice against her cheeks. She had been running since before dawn. Her captors, a group of men who had held her at a remote lodge for 6 days, had grown careless the night before. She had watched them drink themselves into a stupor and had slipped out through a window left unlatched by the youngest of them, a boy barely out of his teens, who had seemed uneasy about the whole arrangement from the start. She had not waited to see if he would raise the alarm. She had simply run. Now, hours later, she was paying for that decision with every muscle in her body. Her legs ached, her hands, wrapped only in a thin pair of gloves she had stolen from the lodge, had gone numb, somewhere around the 2nd hour. She could still feel her heart pounding, though, a frantic drum that refused to slow no matter how exhausted she became. A shout rang out behind her, closer now. She recognized the voice. Callum. He was the one who frightened her most, not because he was the loudest, but because he rarely raised his voice at all. When Callum shouted, it meant he had spotted something. Mara's eyes darted left and right, searching for any kind of cover. The trees here were sparse, thinning out as the ground began to climb. She was heading uphill, she realized, into the mountains proper, away from the valley where the lodge sat, and toward terrain that grew steeper and more unforgiving with every step. She did not know if that was wise. She only knew that going up meant putting more ground between herself and the men chasing her, since the deep snow slowed pursuers just as much as it slowed her, and every step higher meant one more obstacle for them to cross. She pushed on, gasping, her breath forming thick clouds in front of her face. The cold had stopped being simply uncomfortable somewhere in the last half hour. It had become something else, something that gnawed at her fingers and toes with a patient, hungry insistence. She knew, in some distant part of her mind that was still capable of rational thought, that she needed to find shelter soon, or the cold itself would become as dangerous as the men behind her. Another shout, this one further to her right. They were spreading out, trying to flank her. She changed direction instinctively, angling left toward a ridge she could see rising ahead through the trees. If she could get over that ridge, she thought, she might find a place to hide, or at least buy herself a few more minutes. Her foot caught on something buried beneath the snow, a fallen branch or a root, and she went down hard, her palms scraping against the icy ground. For a moment, she simply lay there, chest heaving, the cold seeping through her jacket and into her bones. She thought about staying down, just for a moment, just to catch her breath. Then she heard footsteps, unmistakably closer now, crunching through the snow with the steady rhythm of a man who was not in a hurry, because he believed he did not need to be. Mara pushed herself up, ignoring the sting in her palms, and ran. The ridge came up faster than she expected, a steep slope of rock and snow that forced her to scramble on hands and feet. She did not care about dignity or grace. She cared only about the top of that ridge and whatever lay beyond it. Her fingers found purchase on frozen rock, her boots slipping and catching, until finally she hauled herself over the crest and collapsed for just a moment on the other side. Below her, the land dropped away into a narrow valley, thick with snow and shadow. She could see no lodge, no trail, no sign of civilization at all, just white and gray, stretching out toward mountains that climbed higher still in the distance. For a moment, despair threatened to overtake her. She was utterly lost, in terrain she did not know, being hunted by men who knew these mountains far better than she did. But despair was a luxury she could not afford. She forced herself back to her feet and began working her way down the far side of the ridge, using rocks and stunted trees as handholds. Her body screamed at her to stop, to rest, to simply lie down in the snow and let the cold take her, rather than continue this endless, brutal flight. She refused to listen. A voice called out from the ridge behind her, and this time she did glance back, just for an instant. She saw a figure silhouetted against the gray sky, tall and broad-shouldered, scanning the valley below. It was not Callum. It was Victor, the largest of the three men, the one whose silence unsettled her almost as much as Callum's careful voice. He had not seen her yet. She was certain of that, or she would already be hearing him give chase. She dropped low, moving quickly along the base of the ridge, keeping to what little cover the terrain offered. Her mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. She could try to circle back toward the valley she had come from, but that risked running directly into the men she was trying to escape. She could continue deeper into the mountains, but the cold was becoming a genuine threat now, one that grew more serious with every passing minute. She thought of the boy who had left the window unlatched. He had looked at her, in the moments before she slipped away, with something that might have been guilt, or might have been fear of his own. She wondered, distantly, what would happen to him if the others discovered what he had done. She pushed the thought away. She could not afford to worry about anyone but herself right now. The valley floor was treacherous, littered with rocks hidden beneath the snow, and more than once she nearly turned an ankle stepping into a hollow she could not see. She kept moving anyway, weaving between stands of trees, following the natural contours of the land as it wound deeper into the mountain range. The wind grew stronger as she went, whipping snow into her face, stinging her eyes until tears froze on her lashes. She did not know how long she walked before the shouting behind her finally faded. It might have been 20 minutes. It might have been an hour. Time had become a strange, elastic thing, stretched and compressed by fear and exhaustion in equal measure. When she finally allowed herself to stop, leaning against the trunk of a half-buried pine, she heard nothing but wind and her own ragged breathing. For a moment, relief washed over her, so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. She had lost them, or at least, she had gained enough distance that their voices no longer reached her. But the relief was short-lived, replaced almost immediately by a new and more insidious fear. She looked around at the landscape, at the endless white slopes and dark stands of trees, and realized she had absolutely no idea where she was. The sky had grown darker still, thick clouds rolling in from the west, low and heavy with the promise of more snow. The wind carried a bite that had not been there an hour before, a deeper, more penetrating cold that made her already numb fingers ache in a new and alarming way. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, though she knew it offered little real protection against what was coming. She needed shelter. That realization settled into her mind, with the same weight as her earlier fear of the men chasing her, perhaps even heavier, because at least the men could be reasoned with, outrun, or avoided. The mountain itself cared nothing for her survival. It would take her life as easily and as thoughtlessly as it might take a fallen leaf, without malice, without hesitation, simply because that was the nature of cold and stone and endless white. Mara pushed away from the tree and began walking again, more slowly now, conserving what strength she had left. She scanned the terrain ahead for anything that might offer protection from the coming storm. An overhang, a cave, even a dense enough stand of trees to break the worst of the wind. She saw nothing but more slopes, more snow, more of the same relentless landscape stretching out in every direction. The first flakes of new snow began to fall as she crested a small rise, drifting down lazily at first, before the wind caught them and turned them into a stinging, horizontal assault. She lowered her head against it and pressed on, one foot in front of the other, telling herself that stopping now would mean the end of everything. She had come too far, survived too much, to let the mountain finish what her captors had started. Behind her, somewhere beyond the ridge and the valley, and all the ground she had covered, she thought she heard, just once more, the distant echo of a voice calling her name. She did not stop to listen for it again. She simply walked on, deeper into the white, deeper into the unknown, with the storm closing in around her like a fist. The snow thickened with every passing minute, until Mara could barely see more than a few steps ahead of her. The world had narrowed to a small, swirling circle of white, and within that circle there was nothing to guide her, no landmark, no sense of direction, only the ceaseless fall of snow and the howling of a wind that seemed to come from every side at once. She had read once, long ago, in some article she had barely paid attention to at the time, that people lost in storms like this often walked in circles without realizing it. Her body, she remembered, would naturally favor one leg over the other, causing her to curve gradually in one direction until she ended up back where she started, or worse, wandered somewhere even more dangerous than where she began. She tried to fight that tendency now, forcing herself to check her bearings against whatever faint shapes she could make out in the storm. A dark smear that might have been a tree, a ridge of rock barely visible through the white haze. Her body was beginning to betray her in other ways as well. The numbness in her fingers had spread to her hands, and she found it increasingly difficult to flex them, to grip anything, to feel the texture of the world around her. Her feet had gone the same way sometime in the last hour, each step landing with a strange, disconnected sensation, as though she were walking on limbs that belonged to someone else. She knew, somewhere in the rational part of her mind that grew quieter with every passing minute, that this was the cold doing its work, methodically shutting down the parts of her body it deemed less essential in order to protect the core. She began to see things that were not there. A cabin, warm light glowing from its windows, standing just ahead through the snow. She walked toward it with a surge of hope so powerful it brought tears to her eyes, only to find, as she drew closer, that it was nothing more than a strangely shaped boulder, its surface crusted with ice, that had caught the gray light in a way that mimicked, for just a moment, the warm glow of a window. She stood before the boulder, disappointment crashing over her with an intensity that felt disproportionate, absurd, and yet entirely real. She pressed on. What else was there to do? Stopping meant surrendering to the cold, and some stubborn, animal part of her refused to do that, even as her thoughts grew sluggish and strange, drifting toward memories she had not visited in years. She thought of her mother's kitchen, the smell of bread baking on a winter afternoon. She thought of a summer years ago, swimming in a lake so warm it felt like bath water. She thought, with a clarity that startled her, of the boy who had left the window unlatched, and wondered again what had become of him. The wind shifted, and for a moment the snow thinned enough that she caught sight of a dark shape looming ahead, larger and more solid than any boulder. She blinked hard, half expecting it to dissolve the way the cabin had, but it remained, a steep wall of gray rock rising up out of the white, its face streaked with ice and shadow. She altered her course toward it, some instinct telling her that rock meant possible shelter, an overhang, a crevice, anything that might shield her from the wind even for a few minutes. As she drew closer, she realized the rock face was larger than she had first thought, stretching upward and outward in both directions as far as she could see through the storm. It seemed to form the side of a small ridge, or perhaps the base of a much larger peak, its surface pockmarked with cracks and shallow depressions that offered little in the way of true shelter. She moved along its base regardless, running her numb hands along the stone, searching for any gap deep enough to crawl into. Her mind, growing foggier by the minute, struggled to hold on to the urgency of her situation. She found herself thinking, with a kind of detached curiosity that frightened her more than the cold itself, that it might not be so bad to simply sit down here, out of the worst of the wind, and rest for just a little while. The thought arrived gently, almost kindly, wrapped in a warmth that had no business existing in weather like this. She recognized it, somewhere in the last clear corner of her mind, as a symptom of the cold overtaking her body, a dangerous, seductive calm that preceded something far worse. She forced herself to keep moving. The rock face curved, and she followed it, one hand trailing along the stone to keep herself oriented in the whiteout. The wind seemed to lessen slightly here, the curve of the rock offering some small measure of protection, and she paused to catch her breath, chest heaving, her vision swimming at the edges. It was in that pause that she noticed something odd about the stone beneath her fingers. It did not feel like the rest of the rock face, rough and uneven and cold as ice. Here, the surface felt smoother, almost regular, with a texture that reminded her, distantly, of old wood. She blinked, trying to clear the fog from her thoughts, and looked more closely at what her hand had found. Snow had drifted up against this section of the rock face, forming a small bank that obscured most of what lay beneath. But where her hand had brushed some of it away, she could see dark wood, weathered and cracked but unmistakably shaped by human hands, set into the stone itself. She stared at it for a long moment, her exhausted mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. A beam. It was a wooden beam, thick and old, braced against the rock in a way that suggested it had been placed there deliberately, long ago, by someone who had needed it for some purpose she could not yet guess. Her heart, already pounding from exertion, quickened further with a fresh surge of something that felt almost like hope. She began to dig at the snow with her numb hands, ignoring the pain that flared in her fingers with each motion. The bank was deep, packed hard by wind and time, but she worked at it with a desperation that came from someplace beyond conscious thought, some primal recognition that whatever lay beneath this snow might be the difference between surviving the night and not. Bit by bit, the shape beneath the snow revealed itself. More wooden beams, framing something square and deliberate against the rock. An old iron fixture, rusted nearly black, jutting out at an angle that suggested a handle or a hinge. Mara's breath caught in her throat as the realization settled over her, cutting through even the thick fog of cold and exhaustion that had claimed her mind. It was a door, or what had once been a door, built into the mountainside itself, half buried by decades, or perhaps centuries of snow and ice. She had no idea what lay beyond it, whether it led anywhere at all, or simply into a shallow recess that would offer no more protection than the open rock face already did. But it was something, a structure, built by human hands, in a place where nothing else suggested that any person had ever passed before. She redoubled her efforts, clearing snow away from the frame with hands that had gone past numbness into something that barely registered as pain anymore. The storm raged around her, indifferent to her discovery, the wind screaming across the rock face, as though furious at her intrusion. She ignored it, focused entirely on the door before her, on the possibility of shelter, of survival, of an end to the relentless cold that had been chasing her every bit as persistently as the men she had fled hours before. Finally, with the frame mostly clear, she threw her weight against the door, expecting it to hold fast, rusted and frozen in place by years of neglect. Instead, it gave way with a groan of old hinges, swinging inward into darkness, so sudden and complete that for a moment she simply stood frozen at the threshold, staring into a black that the gray light of the storm could not penetrate. She hesitated only a moment before stepping through, leaving the screaming wind and biting snow behind her, and passing into a stillness so profound it felt like stepping into another world entirely. The darkness inside was absolute, but the silence was what struck her first. Outside, the storm had been a living, roaring thing, pressing against her from every direction. Here, past the threshold, the wind vanished entirely, as though the door had sealed away not just the snow but the very sound of the world she had left behind. Mara stood still for a long moment, breathing hard, letting her eyes adjust to the dark and her mind catch up with the sudden shift in her surroundings. She fumbled in her jacket pocket for the small flashlight she had taken from the lodge before her escape, one of the few useful items she had managed to grab in the chaos of slipping away unnoticed. Her fingers, still clumsy with cold, took several attempts to find the switch, but when the beam finally cut through the darkness, she gasped at what it revealed. She stood in a tunnel, narrow, but tall enough that she did not need to stoop, its walls braced with the same weathered timber she had uncovered outside. The beam of her flashlight danced across old support beams, some still solid, others sagging with age, and floor that had been carved or blasted directly from the mountain rock. This was no natural cave. It was, unmistakably, a mine, dug deep into the stone by hands that had labored here long before she was born. She took a few tentative steps forward, her flashlight sweeping left and right, searching for any sign of instability that might warn her against going further. The air inside was still and cool, but nowhere near as bitterly cold as the storm outside, and she found herself unconsciously relaxing, just slightly, as the immediate threat of freezing eased its grip on her. The tunnel sloped gently downward, and she followed it, one hand trailing along the rough wall for balance and reassurance. Every few steps, she paused to listen, half expecting to hear the storm somehow find its way in after her, or worse, to hear the voices of the men who had been chasing her echo down from the entrance. But there was nothing, only her own breathing, and the faint, steady drip of water, somewhere deeper in the darkness. After a few minutes of walking, the tunnel widened into a small chamber, and Mara stopped in surprise at what her flashlight revealed. This space had clearly served some purpose beyond simple passage. A rough wooden table stood against one wall, its surface littered with old tools, rusted nearly to uselessness. Beside it sat a low bench, and above both, carved into the rock itself, was a shallow shelf that still held the remains of what might once have been lanterns or candles. She moved closer, running her flashlight over the tools on the table. Pickaxes with broken handles, a rusted lantern, its glass long shattered, a small metal box, its hinges seized with rust, that she did not attempt to open just yet. Everything here spoke of a place abandoned suddenly, or perhaps simply forgotten, left exactly as it had been, on whatever day the last miner walked out and never returned. Despite the age and decay around her, Mara noticed something curious. The chamber, unlike the tunnel she had walked through, felt warm. Not simply less cold than the storm outside, but genuinely warm, in a way that made no sense for a space carved deep into a frozen mountain. She held her hands out experimentally, feeling the numbness in her fingers begin to ease, for the first time since she had fled the lodge that morning. She told herself it was simply the shelter from the wind, the insulation of solid rock blocking out the worst of the mountain's cold. That explanation made sense, and she clung to it as she settled onto the old wooden bench, finally allowing her exhausted body a moment of true rest. She switched off her flashlight to conserve its battery, sitting in the dark and listening to the silence, broken only by that same distant, rhythmic drip of water. As her eyes adjusted further, she noticed something she had missed before. A faint light, so dim she had first mistaken it for a trick of her strained vision, seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper in the mine. She stared into the darkness for a long moment, uncertain whether she was imagining it, before deciding to investigate. Whatever waited deeper in these tunnels, she reasoned, might offer answers about why this place felt so strangely different from the frozen world outside. She switched her flashlight back on, and continued down the sloping passage, moving more slowly now, both from exhaustion and from a growing sense of caution. The mine, she reminded herself, could easily hide dangers of its own. Unstable ceilings, hidden shafts, pockets of foul air that miners in ages past had learned to fear. She kept her steps careful, and her flashlight beam sweeping constantly across floor and ceiling alike. The passage forked twice, and both times she chose the route that seemed to slope more gently downward, reasoning that whatever faint light she had seen was coming from somewhere deeper in the mountain, rather than higher up toward the surface. Each fork revealed more small chambers, some empty, others still holding scattered tools and equipment left behind by miners, who had clearly worked here for some considerable time. In one such chamber, she found something that made her pause. A small alcove, carved with more care than the rough tunnels around it, held what appeared to be a shrine of some kind. Stones had been arranged deliberately on a narrow ledge, along with what might once have been dried flowers, now reduced to brittle, colorless husks. Above the ledge, symbols had been carved into the rock, worn smooth by time, but still faintly visible in the beam of her flashlight. She did not recognize the symbols, though something about their shape, spiraling and interconnected, struck her as oddly familiar, as though she had seen something similar once in a book or a museum, without remembering the context. She lingered only a moment before continuing on, unwilling to spend too much time in one place while she remained uncertain of her situation. The tunnel continued to slope downward, and the strange warmth she had noticed in the first chamber grew more pronounced the further she walked. By the time she reached what seemed to be the lowest point she had encountered so far, she found herself unbuttoning her jacket, genuinely warm for the first time in longer than she could remember. It was here that she finally understood the source of the faint light she had seen from above. The tunnel opened into a larger cavern, and embedded in one wall, threading through the rock in delicate, branching patterns, was a vein of some mineral she did not recognize, glowing with a soft, pale luminescence that required no flame or battery to sustain itself. She stood at the cavern's entrance for a long moment, simply staring, her exhaustion and fear momentarily forgotten in the face of something so strange and unexpected. The glow was not bright, nothing like a proper light source, but it filled the cavern with just enough illumination that she could make out its rough dimensions, walls curving upward into darkness, the floor uneven but passable. She switched off her flashlight again, allowing her eyes to adjust fully to the mineral's pale glow, and found that she could see reasonably well without it. The cavern bathed in a soft, otherworldly light that seemed to shift subtly as she moved. She approached the glowing vein cautiously, reaching out a hand before she quite decided to do so, some instinct drawing her toward it despite the part of her mind still cautious and afraid. The mineral felt warm beneath her fingers, warmer even than the air around it, and for a moment she simply stood there, palm pressed against the strange glowing stone, feeling warmth spread up through her arm, in a way that felt almost impossible after the bone-deep cold she had endured all day. She did not know what this mineral was, or why the mountain had chosen to keep such a secret, buried so deep beneath its frozen surface, but she knew, with a growing certainty that settled somewhere deep in her chest, that whatever answers this mine held, She would need to find them before she could decide what to do next. Mara sat down on a smooth outcropping of rock near the glowing vein, allowing herself, finally, a real moment of rest. The warmth radiating from the mineral seeped into her tired muscles, easing aches she had not fully registered until this moment of stillness. She peeled off her soaked gloves and flexed her fingers, watching with quiet relief as sensation returned to them fully for the first time since early that morning. She thought about the men who had chased her, wondering how far behind they had fallen, whether the storm had forced them to turn back toward the lodge, or whether they were still out there somewhere in the white, searching for her tracks before the snow buried them completely. She thought, too, about the boy who had left the window unlatched, and hoped, with a fierceness that surprised her, that he had found some way to protect himself from whatever consequences might follow her escape. But mostly, in this strange, quiet cavern with its impossible warm glow, she found her mind turning toward the mystery of the place itself. Who had built this mine, and why had they abandoned it so completely, leaving tools and personal items scattered as though they had simply walked away one day and never returned? And what was this mineral, glowing softly in the rock, radiating a warmth that made no sense given everything she understood about how mountains and stone were supposed to behave? She decided, after resting for what felt like perhaps 20 minutes, though time had become difficult to track in the strange, timeless quality of the cavern, to explore further. If there were answers to be found, she reasoned, they were more likely to be written down somewhere than simply left for her to guess at. She remembered the small metal box she had seen on the table in the first chamber, and resolved to return to it, curious now about what it might contain. She rose, pulling her gloves back on despite their dampness, and made her way back up the sloping tunnel toward the chamber where she had first rested. The mine felt different now that she had glimpsed its stranger depths, the ordinary tunnels somehow less unsettling now that she had seen what lay beyond them. She reached the chamber with the old table and knelt beside it, examining the small metal box more closely in the beam of her flashlight. Its hinges were rusted nearly solid, but after several minutes of careful work, prying gently with one of the smaller tools she found on the table, she managed to force it open. Inside, protected somewhat from moisture by the box's tight seal, she found a small stack of papers, yellowed and brittle but still legible, covered in cramped, careful handwriting. She read by the light of her flashlight, her breath held as she made out the first few lines. The handwriting belonged, it seemed, to a man named Edwin Holt, who identified himself as the foreman of a mining operation that had worked this mountain many decades before. His entries were dated, though the ink had faded enough on some pages that she struggled to make out exact years, and they described, in careful, methodical prose, the discovery of what he called simply the vein. Edwin's early entries were mundane, describing the day-to-day work of the mine, the difficulties of hauling equipment up the mountain in winter, disputes among the workers over pay and conditions. But partway through the stack of papers, his tone shifted noticeably, growing more excited, then increasingly cautious, and finally, in the last several entries, something closer to fearful. He described finding the glowing vein deep in the mountain, much as Mara herself had found it, and the strange effects it seemed to have on those who worked near it for extended periods. Miners who spent their days in the deeper tunnels, he wrote, began to report an unusual resistance to the bitter mountain cold, needing fewer layers of clothing, even as winter deepened around them. Edwin himself, by his own account, found that he no longer felt the cold the way he once had, even on the mountain's exposed upper slopes. Mara read on, her fascination mixing uneasily with a growing sense of caution. Edwin's later entries described some of the miners growing reluctant to leave the mountain at all, even when the mining season ended and the others prepared to return to their homes in the valley below. He wrote of arguments among the men, some insisting they should study the vein further, others growing fearful of its effects, and demanding they seal the mine and never return. The final entry in the stack was shorter than the rest, the handwriting noticeably less steady. Edwin wrote that he had made a decision to seal the deepest tunnels, believing that whatever the vein was doing to those who spent time near it, the effects went beyond simple resistance to cold, into something he did not fully understand and had grown afraid to continue studying. He noted that some of the miners had refused to leave, choosing to remain in the mountain despite his warnings, and that he intended to seal the entrance behind him once he departed, to prevent others from stumbling upon what he now considered a danger rather than a discovery. Mara set the papers down for a moment, considering what she had read. If the entrance had indeed been sealed, The door she had uncovered must have been reopened, or perhaps never properly closed at all, weathered open again by decades of storms and shifting snow. She wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, what had become of the miners who chose to stay behind, and whether any trace of them still remained somewhere in these tunnels. She gathered the papers carefully, tucking them into an inner pocket of her jacket, and continued to search the chamber for anything else that might offer further explanation. She found little of additional interest, only more scattered tools, and the remnants of what might once have been sleeping quarters, a few rotted blankets, and the frame of a simple cot pushed against one wall. As she worked, she noticed something she had not registered before, in her initial exhaustion. Faint markings covered portions of the chamber's walls, similar in style to the symbols she had glimpsed in the small shrine deeper in the mine, though cruder here, as though carved in haste rather than with careful devotion. She traced one of the symbols with her finger, feeling the shallow grooves worn smooth by time, and found herself wondering again where she had seen shapes like this before. A soft sound echoed somewhere in the tunnels behind her, and Mara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She held perfectly still, straining to identify the noise, uncertain whether it had come from deeper in the mine or from the entrance far above. After a long moment of silence, she decided it must have been nothing more than settling stone, or perhaps the wind finding some new gap to howl through outside. Still, the moment reminded her forcefully of her situation, alone, in an unknown mine, on a mountain where men who wished her harm might still be searching. She considered her options carefully. She could not stay in this mine forever, however strange and warm its depths proved to be. Eventually she would need food, water beyond what she might find dripping somewhere in these tunnels, and a way to make contact with the outside world, to find help, to escape this mountain entirely. But venturing back out into the storm, exhausted as she still was despite her rest, seemed like a decision that could easily prove fatal. She resolved, for now, to remain in the mine until the worst of the storm passed, using the time to rest properly, to explore further if her curiosity and caution allowed it, and to consider carefully how she might eventually make her way back to safety, without running directly into the men who had chased her here. She gathered a few of the less rotted blankets from the old sleeping quarters, deciding they would offer at least some additional warmth, however unnecessary that warmth seemed to be growing in this strange, glowing mountain. As she settled back into the warmer depths near the glowing vein, wrapping herself in the old blankets, she found her thoughts returning again and again to Edwin Holt's careful, worried handwriting, and to the miners who had chosen to remain in this mountain, rather than return to the world above. She wondered what had truly happened to them, and whether the changes she already felt beginning in her own body, the ease with which the cold no longer troubled her, were the beginning of something similar to whatever had claimed them so long ago. Mara woke with a start, uncertain for a moment where she was, or how much time had passed. The soft glow of the mineral vein still bathed the cavern in its pale light, and for a moment, she simply lay still among the old blankets, listening to the quiet drip of water somewhere in the tunnels, trying to remember the details of the dream that had woken her. She had dreamed of the lodge, of the men who had held her there, though the dream had twisted their faces into something less human, more shadow than substance, chasing her through corridors that shifted and lengthened no matter how fast she ran. She shook off the lingering unease and sat up, checking her watch, though its hands told her only that several hours had passed, offering no way to know whether it was still night outside, or whether dawn had come and gone while she slept. She decided to explore further, reasoning that a fuller understanding of the mine might help her find a safer way out, perhaps a second entrance that would let her avoid whatever route the men chasing her might expect she would take. She gathered Edwin's papers and her flashlight, though she found she barely needed the beam now that her eyes had grown accustomed to the mineral's gentle glow, and set off deeper into the tunnels beyond the cavern. The passage beyond the glowing chamber narrowed considerably, forcing her to duck in places where the ceiling sagged low, timber supports groaning faintly under the weight of the mountain above. She moved carefully, testing each section of flooring before committing her full weight, mindful of Edwin's warnings about the dangers of these old workings even as her curiosity pulled her onward. She began to notice, as she went deeper, more of the strange carved symbols she had seen before, appearing with greater frequency the further she traveled from the entrance. Some were simple, single spirals or interlocking circles, while others grew more elaborate, covering entire sections of wall in patterns that seemed almost deliberately hypnotic to look at for too long. She found herself lingering before one particularly large carving, tracing its lines with her eyes, before catching herself and forcing her attention back to the practical matter of navigating the tunnels. After perhaps 20 minutes of careful walking, she came upon a chamber larger than any she had yet encountered, its ceiling rising high enough that her flashlight beam could not fully illuminate it. Here, the glowing mineral appeared not just as a vein running through the walls, but in thick, branching formations that climbed toward the ceiling, like frozen lightning, casting the entire chamber in a soft, shifting radiance that reminded her, oddly, of moonlight filtered through water. In the center of this chamber stood a structure that stopped her in her tracks. It was not natural, not carved by simple mining efforts, but built, deliberately and with obvious care, from stones fitted together with a precision that seemed to require far more skill than she would have expected from a group of working miners. The structure rose in tiers, each level slightly smaller than the one below, until it reached a flat platform, at roughly the height of her shoulders, upon which sat a single, larger piece of the glowing mineral, unworked and raw, pulsing faintly with a light that seemed almost to breathe. She approached slowly, her earlier caution warring with an overwhelming curiosity that she found difficult to resist. This, she understood immediately, was no ordinary mining discovery. This was something the miners had built, deliberately, around whatever they had found here, a structure that suggested reverence, or perhaps fear, or perhaps both intertwined in ways she did not yet understand. She circled the structure carefully, her flashlight beam sweeping across its surface, and noticed additional carvings covering its stone tiers, more detailed and precise than any she had seen elsewhere in the mine. These carvings told a story, she realized slowly, piecing together the images as she moved around the structure. Figures depicted in simple, stylized forms showed men working in tunnels, discovering the glowing vein, and then, in later panels, standing before this very structure, hands raised as though in supplication or celebration. The final panels, however, told a darker story. The stylized figures grew fewer with each successive image, until only a handful remained, depicted standing alone in the glowing chamber, while the tunnels around them, shown in cruder detail, appeared to collapse or seal themselves entirely. She could not be certain of the exact meaning, the carvings crude enough to allow multiple interpretations, but a chill ran through her regardless, one that had nothing to do with temperature. She retrieved Edwin's papers from her jacket and reread his final entries more carefully, searching for any additional details she might have missed in her first hasty reading. She found, tucked into a margin she had overlooked before, a brief note in different handwriting, cramped and hurried, that seemed to have been added by someone other than Edwin himself. It read simply that those who remained believed the mountain had chosen them, and that they intended to stay until the choosing was complete, whatever that phrase might have meant to whoever had written it. Mara lowered the papers, staring at the raw, pulsing mineral atop the stone structure before her. She thought of her own experience since entering the mine, the ease with which the numbing cold outside had faded from her memory, the strange warmth that had settled into her bones and refused to leave even now, hours after she had first taken shelter here. She wondered, with a growing unease she could not quite shake, whether she too was being chosen, in whatever sense the miners had meant by that word. She reached out, almost without deciding to, and let her fingers hover just above the raw mineral's surface, feeling warmth radiate from it, even without direct contact. Some part of her wanted to touch it fully, to understand completely whatever change had already begun within her, while another part, quieter but no less insistent, warned her to step back, to leave this chamber and its strange history behind, before she became too entangled in whatever process the mountain had set in motion. Before she could decide, a distant sound reached her ears, faint but unmistakable this time. The echo of voices carried down through the tunnels from somewhere far above. Her heart lurched, and she stepped back from the glowing structure immediately, her earlier fascination replaced by sharp, practical fear. The men chasing her, or perhaps others entirely, had found their way into the mine. She extinguished her flashlight and stood perfectly still in the glowing chamber, straining to listen more closely. The voices were faint enough that she could not make out words, only the general rhythm of speech, and she could not immediately tell whether they were drawing closer or moving away. She thought of the boy who had left the window unlatched, wondering, absurdly, whether he might somehow be among whoever had entered the mine, though she knew the thought made little sense, given everything she understood about her situation. She needed to decide quickly whether to retreat deeper into the mine, away from the entrance and whoever had followed her inside, or whether to attempt some kind of confrontation, perhaps using the mine's confusing layout to her advantage. She thought of the fork in the tunnels she had passed earlier, and of how easily someone unfamiliar with the mine's layout might become lost or disoriented in its winding passages. Gathering her resolve, Mara moved quietly toward the chamber's far side, where the tunnel continued deeper into the mountain, away from the direction the voices seemed to be coming from. She would use the mine itself as her ally now, she decided, letting its darkness and confusion work against whoever had come searching for her, just as it had, until now, worked in her favor. Mara moved quickly but carefully through the tunnels, retracing her steps from memory, rather than relying on her flashlight, which she kept switched off to avoid revealing her position. The soft glow of the mineral veins running through the walls provided just enough light to navigate by, though the deeper passages grew darker, forcing her to rely increasingly on touch and memory alone. The voices behind her grew clearer as she moved, and she caught fragments of words now, enough to recognize, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, the low, measured tone of Callum's voice, and beneath it, the deeper rumble that could only belong to Victor. They had found the entrance then, and had followed her down into the mine itself, drawn perhaps by the same storm that had forced her to seek shelter here in the first place, or perhaps simply by careful tracking of her footprints before the snow had covered them completely. She reached the fork in the tunnels she remembered from earlier, and paused, weighing her options. One passage led back toward the small shrine she had discovered, and beyond it, deeper still, toward the large chamber with its glowing structure. The other, narrower and less explored, branched off in a direction she had not yet investigated. She chose the unfamiliar path, reasoning that unpredictability might serve her better than retreating to ground she had already covered, ground the men behind her might logically expect her to return to. The narrower tunnel forced her to move more slowly, its ceiling lower, and its floor rougher than the passages she had grown accustomed to. She kept one hand trailing along the wall, feeling her way forward in the dim light, listening constantly for any sign that her pursuers had chosen the same route, or had instead followed the more obvious path, deeper into the mine. After several minutes of careful progress, the tunnel widened slightly, and she found herself in a small chamber, unlike any she had encountered so far. Here, the mineral veins in the walls had grown so dense that the entire space glowed with a brightness closer to true daylight than the soft ambient light of the other chambers. She paused, momentarily dazzled, before her eyes adjusted and she took in her surroundings more fully. The chamber was empty of any structures or carvings, simply a natural hollow in the rock where the glowing mineral had concentrated more heavily than elsewhere. But what caught her attention immediately was a second passage leading out from the far side of the chamber, one that sloped noticeably upward rather than continuing to descend deeper into the mountain. Her heart quickened with cautious hope. This passage, she reasoned, might lead to another exit entirely, one that could allow her to leave the mine without crossing paths with the men searching for her. Before she could investigate further, she heard footsteps echoing down the tunnel behind her, closer now than she had realized, and she pressed herself against the chamber wall, extinguishing even the thought of using her flashlight. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the beam of an actual flashlight sweeping across the tunnel walls, and she recognized, with a jolt of fear, that whoever approached had chosen the same narrow passage she herself had taken. She had only seconds to decide. The upward-sloping passage on the far side of the chamber offered her best chance of escape, but reaching it meant crossing open ground, fully illuminated by the chamber's dense mineral glow, directly in the path of whoever was approaching. She weighed the risk against the certainty of discovery if she remained where she stood, and made her decision. Moving as quickly and quietly as she could manage, Mara darted across the glowing chamber toward the upward passage, her heart hammering so loudly she felt certain it must be audible to whoever followed behind her. She reached the passage entrance just as the beam of the pursuing flashlight swept into the chamber, and she ducked into the shadows of the new tunnel, pressing herself flat against the rock and holding her breath. For a long, terrifying moment, she heard the footsteps pause at the chamber's entrance, and she imagined Callum, or perhaps Victor, standing there, scanning the glowing space for any sign of her. She did not dare to look, keeping her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead of her, willing herself to remain perfectly still, despite every instinct urging her to run. The footsteps resumed, but to her relief, They continued deeper into the mine, along the original passage, rather than turning toward the upward slope where she hid. She waited several more minutes after the sound had faded entirely, before allowing herself to move again, her legs shaking slightly with the release of tension she had been holding. She continued up the new passage, moving as quietly as she could, despite her growing exhaustion, and found that it climbed steadily, the mineral glow growing fainter the higher she went, until she found herself once again relying on her flashlight to see. The air grew noticeably colder as she climbed, a change she noted with some surprise, given how thoroughly the mine's lower depths had banished any sense of chill from her body. After perhaps 10 minutes of steady climbing, she began to hear a new sound, faint but unmistakable, the distant howl of wind. Her pace quickened, despite her tired legs, hope propelling her forward as the passage narrowed further, clearly approaching some kind of exit to the world above. She emerged, finally, into a small alcove where daylight, gray and diffuse through the still falling snow, filtered down from an opening above her. The passage ended here, at the base of what appeared to be a narrow chimney of rock, climbable but difficult, leading up toward the surface, and the raging storm she could hear clearly now, howling just beyond the opening. Mara stood at the base of this natural chimney for a long moment, considering her options. Climbing out here would place her back in the storm, in unknown terrain, with no certainty of where exactly on the mountain she would emerge, or how far she might be from any kind of safety. But remaining in the mine meant continuing to risk discovery by the men who had followed her inside, men who clearly had no intention of giving up their search easily. She thought of Edwin Holt's careful, worried handwriting, and of the miners who had chosen to remain in this mountain, rather than face whatever waited for them outside. She wondered whether she was now facing a similar choice, though her circumstances differed considerably from theirs. She had not been drawn here by curiosity or greed, but had stumbled upon this place while fleeing a very real and immediate danger. Still uncertain, she began to climb, working her way up the narrow rock chimney toward the gray daylight above, one careful handhold at a time, the sound of the storm growing louder with every foot she ascended. The wind hit her like a physical blow the moment her head cleared the opening, snow driving into her face, with a force that made her gasp and nearly lose her grip on the rock. She hauled herself the rest of the way up, emerging onto a narrow ledge partway up the mountainside, the storm raging around her in full fury, visibility reduced once again to only a few feet in any direction. She braced herself against the rock, expecting the familiar, punishing cold to seize her body the way it had before she found the mine. But as the seconds passed, she realized, with a strange mixture of relief and unease, that the expected assault never came. The wind still howled, the snow still stung against her exposed skin, but the deep, bone-aching cold that had nearly claimed her life hours before simply was not there anymore. She stood on the ledge for a long moment, testing this realization, flexing her ungloved fingers in the icy wind, feeling the cold's presence, its physical reality, without any of the accompanying pain or danger she had come to expect. It was as though her body had simply stopped registering the cold as a threat, processing it now as nothing more than a sensation, distant and inconsequential. Fear and wonder mixed uneasily within her as she considered what this meant. She thought immediately of Edwin's account, of the miners who had reported similar resistance to the cold after spending time near the glowing vein, and of his growing alarm as the changes in his men deepened beyond anything he found comfortable or safe. She had touched nothing directly, had only rested near the mineral's warmth, and passed close by its raw, unworked form in that deep chamber. Yet something had already changed within her, quickly and thoroughly enough that she now stood in the heart of a raging blizzard, feeling nothing more than mild discomfort. She pushed the thought aside for the moment, recognizing that survival remained her most immediate priority, regardless of whatever strange transformation might be occurring within her body. She scanned what little of the mountainside she could make out through the storm, trying to orient herself, though the featureless white made the task nearly impossible. A sound reached her through the wind, faint but unmistakably human, and she turned toward it with a jolt of alarm, uncertain whether it came from above or below her position on the narrow ledge. She pressed herself against the rock face, straining to identify the source, and after a moment, she recognized it as Victor's voice, calling out something she could not quite make out, the words torn away by the wind before they fully reached her. She realized, with rising panic, that the men must have found another way up through the mountain, or perhaps had exited through the same passage she had used, following her more closely than she had realized during her escape through the tunnels below. She needed to move, and quickly, before whoever called out spotted her against the gray rock of the ledge. She began working her way carefully along the ledge, searching for any route that might lead her further from the sound of that voice, her bare hands gripping the icy rock without the pain or clumsiness she had experienced during her earlier flight through the storm. This newfound resistance to the cold, whatever its cause, proved unexpectedly useful now, allowing her to move with a steadiness and confidence that would have been impossible for her frozen, numb hands only hours before. The ledge narrowed further as she progressed, forcing her to move with painstaking care, one misstep threatening a fall that the raging storm made impossible to judge the true danger of. She kept her eyes fixed on the rock immediately before her, trusting her hands and feet to find secure holds, while her mind raced through possibilities for where this path might lead, and whether it offered any genuine hope of escape. After several tense minutes, the ledge widened into what seemed to be a small plateau, and Mara paused there, using the relatively more stable ground to reassess her situation. The voice she had heard earlier had gone quiet, though she could not be certain whether that meant her pursuer had lost her trail, or had simply drawn close enough that shouting was no longer necessary. She crouched low, scanning the swirling white for any sign of movement, and it was in this position, still and watchful, that she first noticed something strange happening to the storm itself, in the immediate area around her. The snow seemed to fall differently near her. The wind's howling force somehow lessened within a small radius surrounding where she crouched, as though some invisible boundary held the worst of the weather at bay just beyond her immediate presence. She initially dismissed this as imagination, a trick of exhaustion and fear playing with her perception, but as she rose and moved a short distance across the plateau, she noticed the effect persisted, the storm's fury seeming to soften subtly in whatever space she occupied, only to intensify again the moment she paused and the area around her settled. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but combined with her newfound resistance to the cold itself, it suggested something far stranger occurring within her than simple physical adaptation. A shape emerged from the white ahead of her, sudden and solid, and Mara froze, recognizing Victor's broad silhouette even through the swirling snow. He had not yet seen her, his attention focused on the ground before him, clearly searching for tracks or some other sign of her passage. She held perfectly still, weighing whether to retreat back the way she had come, or to attempt some other route around him. Before she could decide, Victor's head lifted, and his eyes found her across the short distance separating them. For a moment, neither of them moved, the storm howling around them both while an unnatural stillness seemed to hold the space between. Then Victor took a step toward her, his expression unreadable through the snow and distance, and Mara understood that whatever calm she had found in the mine's depths was about to be tested in the most immediate and dangerous way possible. Mara backed away instinctively, her boots sliding slightly on the icy plateau, and Victor's pace quickened in response, closing the distance between them with the steady, unhurried confidence of a man who had no doubt about the outcome of this encounter. She glanced quickly around her, searching for any avenue of retreat, and spotted the narrow ledge she had climbed along earlier, curving away to her right, toward what she hoped might be another way back down into the mine. She turned and ran, her newfound resistance to the cold allowing her to move with a speed and steadiness that surprised even herself, given how thoroughly exhaustion should have been slowing her by now. Victor called out behind her, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind, telling her to stop, that there was nowhere left to run, that the mountain would finish what pursuit alone could not. She ignored him, focusing entirely on the treacherous ledge ahead, placing each foot with the same careful precision that had carried her safely along it once already. The ledge led her back toward the narrow rock chimney she had climbed out of earlier, and she reached it with Victor still close behind her, his heavier frame slowing him only slightly on the icy terrain. She did not hesitate, dropping back down into the opening and scrambling downward into the passage below, trusting the mine's darkness and confusing layout to work in her favor once again, just as it had before. She heard Victor's muffled shout from the opening above as she descended, and moments later, the scrape and thud of him following her down into the tunnel. She quickened her pace despite the darkness, relying on memory and the faint returning glow of the mineral veins to guide her back toward the larger chambers she had explored earlier. The passage delivered her once again into the small, densely glowing chamber where she had narrowly avoided detection before, and she paused only briefly to get her bearings before continuing onward, choosing this time to head toward the large chamber with its ancient stone structure, reasoning that its open space might offer her more options than the narrow, confining tunnels. Victor's footsteps grew louder behind her, unmistakably closer now, and she pushed herself to move faster, her lungs burning with exertion despite the strange calm that had settled over the rest of her body regarding matters of cold and discomfort. She reached the large chamber and dashed across its open floor, the ancient structure and its glowing mineral centerpiece looming ahead of her like some strange beacon in the shifting light. She rounded the structure, just as Victor emerged from the tunnel behind her, and for a moment, they stood on opposite sides of the ancient stone tiers, each watching the other, warily across the glowing centerpiece. Victor's breathing was heavy, his earlier confidence tempered slightly by the strange, unfamiliar surroundings and the eerie light bathing the chamber in its soft, pulsing glow. He spoke, his voice lower now, more measured, asking her to simply come with him quietly, insisting that whatever she believed about her situation, resistance would only make things more difficult for her in the end. Mara said nothing, circling slowly around the structure to keep it between them, her mind racing through options that grew increasingly limited given the chamber's single obvious exit, the tunnel through which they had both entered. Victor mirrored her movement, keeping pace around the opposite side of the structure, clearly unwilling to simply lunge across it and risk damaging whatever strange formation stood between them. Mara used the moment to glance quickly around the chamber, searching for any additional passage she might have missed during her earlier exploration, any alternative that might offer escape beyond the single route Victor now blocked. Her eyes fell on a narrow gap in the chamber wall, partially obscured by shadow, that she had not noticed during her first visit, too distracted then by the ancient structure and its unsettling carvings. It offered, perhaps, another way out, though she had no way of knowing where it might lead, or whether it would prove passable at all. She made her decision quickly, darting toward the gap while Victor was still working his way around the far side of the structure. He shouted and lunged toward her, but the distance and the awkward footing around the ancient tiers slowed him just enough that she reached the narrow passage several crucial seconds ahead of him, squeezing through the gap into darkness beyond. The passage proved tight, forcing her to turn sideways in places to fit through, but it continued onward, and she pressed forward despite the discomfort, hearing Victor's frustrated shout behind her as he attempted, apparently without success, to fit his broader frame through the same narrow gap. For the moment at least, the mine itself had provided her an escape that his larger size could not follow. She continued through the tight passage for several minutes, her flashlight beam bouncing off close walls on either side, until it finally widened enough to allow her to walk normally again. The tunnel here felt different from the others she had explored, the air carrying a faint mineral scent she had not noticed elsewhere, and the walls, when her light passed over them, revealed veins of the glowing mineral running in denser, more concentrated patterns than anywhere else in the mine. She emerged, after a final turn in the passage, into a chamber unlike anything she had yet encountered, one that made her stop entirely, forgetting for a moment even the danger of Victor searching for another way to reach her, as she took in the sight before her. The chamber was vast, far larger than any space she had passed through so far, its ceiling lost entirely in darkness above the reach of the glowing mineral that covered nearly every surface of the walls and floor. The light here was strong enough that she switched off her flashlight entirely, standing in a soft, silvery radiance that reminded her, in this moment of stillness, of standing beneath a full moon on a clear winter night, though warmer, gentler, without any trace of the biting chill such a night would normally carry. In the center of this great chamber, arranged in a wide circle, stood a series of stone markers, each one roughly the height of a person, worn smooth by what must have been a very long passage of time. Mara approached them slowly, her earlier urgency giving way to a kind of reverent caution as she realized what she was likely looking at. These were not simply decorative structures, they were markers, memorials perhaps, or something closer to gravestones, though unlike any she had seen in ordinary cemeteries. She counted them as she walked the circle. 7 markers in total, each bearing a single carved symbol near its base, similar to those she had seen scattered throughout the mine's other chambers. She thought immediately of Edwin Holt's account, of the miners who had chosen to remain in the mountain rather than leave with the others, and felt a cold certainty settle over her, despite the warmth surrounding her, that she stood now in whatever final resting place those men had found. She moved closer to one of the markers, running her fingers over its worn surface, and noticed that unlike the other carvings she had seen, this one seemed to depict a single figure, arms raised, standing before what could only be the glowing mineral itself, rendered in careful, almost loving detail, compared to the cruder symbols elsewhere in the mine. She wondered whether this had been carved by the miner himself, in some kind of final acknowledgement of the transformation he had undergone, or by someone else who had remained behind to honor those who chose to stay. A soft sound drew her attention away from the marker, not the crunch of footsteps or the echo of a voice, but something gentler, almost like a sigh, carried on air that should not have been moving in a sealed underground chamber. She turned slowly, scanning the vast space, and felt, rather than saw, a presence that seemed to fill the chamber itself, diffuse and formless but undeniably real. She did not feel afraid, strangely, standing there in that ancient circle of markers. Instead, she felt a kind of quiet understanding settling over her, as though the mountain itself, or whatever force resided within its glowing veins, was communicating something to her that words could never fully capture. She thought of the miners who had remained, of Edwin's fear and eventual departure, and understood, with sudden clarity, that this force did not seek to harm those who encountered it, only to change them, slowly and permanently, into something that belonged to the mountain, in a way ordinary people never could. She placed her hand against the nearest marker, feeling its worn stone beneath her palm, and thought of her own situation, of the men who had held her captive, of the storm she had barely survived, of the strange and unasked-for transformation already taking hold within her body. She realized, standing in this quiet circle, that she had a choice to make, though it was a choice unlike any she had faced during her long flight through the mountain. Before she could settle her thoughts fully, a new sound reached her from the passage behind her, footsteps this time, unmistakably human, and she turned to see Victor emerging from the narrow tunnel, having apparently found some way to squeeze through after all, or perhaps another route entirely, that had led him to this same vast chamber. He stopped abruptly upon entering, his expression shifting from grim determination to something closer to awe as he took in the glowing circle of markers and the silvery light filling the entire space. For a long moment, he simply stared, seemingly forgetting, as Mara herself had, the pursuit that had brought him this far. Mara used his momentary distraction to consider her position, standing near the circle's center, while Victor remained close to the tunnel entrance behind her. She had no clear path around him back toward the surface, but something about this chamber, about the quiet presence she had sensed only moments before, gave her an unexpected steadiness she had not felt at any other point during her long ordeal. Victor's gaze finally settled on her again, and he took a step forward, though more cautiously now, as though the strange atmosphere of the chamber had tempered even his earlier confidence. He spoke again, telling her that this had gone on long enough, that she needed to come with him now, that whatever she thought she had found in this mountain changed nothing about her situation. Mara straightened, meeting his gaze steadily across the glowing chamber, and for the first time since her flight had begun, she felt something other than fear rise within her, a quiet, unshakable resolve that seemed to draw strength from the very stone and mineral surrounding her. She told him, her voice steadier than she expected, that she would not be going anywhere with him, that whatever authority he and the others believed they held over her had ended the moment she stepped through that hidden door into the mountain. Victor's expression hardened, and he took another step toward her, closing the distance across the ancient circle of markers. But as he moved, something shifted in the chamber around them, a subtle change in the light, a faint tremor that ran through the stone beneath their feet, as though the mountain itself had taken notice of the confrontation unfolding within its depths. The glow surrounding the circle of markers pulsed once, brightly enough to make Victor flinch and shield his eyes, and a low rumble rolled through the chamber, dust and small fragments of stone drifting down from somewhere in the darkness above. Mara felt no fear at the sound, only a strange, calm certainty that the mountain was not turning against her, but rather answering something within her that had grown stronger with every hour she had spent beneath its surface. Victor stumbled backward, clearly unnerved by the tremor and the sudden intensity of the light, his earlier resolve faltering visibly as he glanced toward the tunnel entrance behind him. Mara watched him carefully, remaining still at the center of the circle, and understood, in that moment, that she did not need to run any further, or fight, or even plead for her freedom. The mountain itself had already decided the shape of what would happen next. Another tremor passed through the chamber, and this time a section of the tunnel behind Victor groaned audibly, small stones clattering down near its entrance. His eyes widened with genuine alarm now, and he called out to her one final time, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence, warning her that the whole mine might be coming down around them, urging her to follow him back toward the surface before it was too late. Mara shook her head slowly, feeling, with absolute certainty, that whatever was happening in this chamber posed no threat to her at all. She told him, calmly, that he should leave while the passage remained open, that this mountain was no longer a place he could follow her into. Something in her voice, or perhaps in the steady, unafraid way she stood amid the trembling stone and pulsing light, seemed to finally convince him. He turned and fled back through the tunnel, his footsteps quick and uneven, vanishing into the darkness without a backward glance. The tremors subsided slowly after he disappeared, the glowing light settling back into its steady, gentle pulse, and Mara remained standing at the center of the ancient circle, alone once more, surrounded by the 7 worn markers and the silvery radiance of the mineral veins. She let out a long breath, feeling something settle within her, a quiet finality that she could not fully explain, but understood on some level deeper than words. She spent what felt like a long while, simply standing there, letting the chamber's stillness wash over her, before turning her thoughts toward practical matters once again. Victor and the others, she reasoned, might return with reinforcements, or might simply retreat from the mountain entirely, frightened by what they had witnessed. She could not know for certain, and she resolved not to wait to find out. She made her way back through the tunnels, retracing her path with a confidence that surprised her, the mine's winding passages no longer holding the same confusion they once had. She passed again through the chamber with the ancient stone structure, through the narrower tunnels beyond it, and finally back toward the entrance where she had first stumbled into the mountain's hidden depths, snow-covered and desperate, only what felt like a lifetime ago. When she reached the old wooden door, she paused, considering whether to seal it behind her as Edwin Holt had once intended to do himself. She decided, after a moment's thought, that the choice belonged to the mountain now, not to her, and she left the door as she found it, weathered and waiting, whatever secrets it guarded settling back into the quiet dark behind her. Stepping outside, Mara found that the storm had finally begun to ease, the wind softening to a gentle breeze, the heavy snowfall thinning into scattered flakes, drifting lazily through air that had grown noticeably calmer. She stood at the threshold for a long moment, looking out over the mountain slopes stretching before her, pale and endless beneath a sky just beginning to clear. She walked forward into the snow, waiting for the familiar bite of cold to greet her as it always had before. It never came. She felt the snow beneath her boots, the breeze against her face, the vast, quiet cold of the mountain surrounding her on every side, and none of it touched her, not truly, not in any way that mattered. She simply existed within it now, untouched, as though the mountain itself had marked her as one of its own. She made her way down the slopes with steady, sure steps, following what she believed to be the general direction of the valley, and, beyond it, whatever roads or towns might offer her a path back to a life she had once known. She did not know exactly what waited for her there, or how she would explain the change that had settled so completely into her body and her sense of the world, but she walked on regardless, calm and unafraid, carrying with her the quiet certainty of the mountain's gift. Hours later, as the last clouds finally broke apart and pale sunlight spilled across the snow, Mara emerged from the tree line into a small valley she recognized, distant smoke rising from a cluster of buildings that promised warmth, people, and a return to the world she had left behind. She paused at the edge of the trees, looking back once toward the mountain she had crossed, its peak now clearly visible against the brightening sky, and felt a quiet gratitude toward whatever strange force had chosen to spare her, to change her, rather than let the cold claim her life as it surely would have otherwise. She walked on toward the distant buildings, unbothered by the chill air around her, carrying forward into her new life a secret the mountain alone had given her, one that would remain with her, unspoken but permanent, for as long as she lived. Winter, from that day forward, never touched her again.